Buenas noches, bienvenidos nuevamente a Opinión Pública. Soy Pachi.valencia. En todo el mundo, el régimen chino se ha asociado con universidades para instalar los ya conocidos Institutos Confucio. Basándose en el nombre del filósofo chino más famoso, Beijing ha promovido estos centros como una puerta educativa al idioma, a la cultura y a la historia china, pero estos centros no son tan benignos como parecen. Los funcionarios chinos se han referido abiertamente a estos institutos Confucio como una parte importante de su propaganda comunista en el extranjero. En Latinoamérica no parece haber mucha conciencia sobre estos centros de idioma chino, los cuales ya cuentan con más de 40 sedes en América Latina. Hoy en Opinión Pública conversé con SeHoon Kim, director de la coalición de Naciones cautivas del Comité sobre el Peligro Presente, China, quien nos habla más sobre los institutos Confucio y la injerencia china a través de la cultura. So where does the United States come in this picture? What's the role there? What should be done?
Right. I think we need to clarify that the Confucius Institutes are not just academic institutes, censoring free speech. I mean, honestly, censoring free speech happens here in the United States. It's very, very frequent, whether it's self-censorship or actual censorship, right? So, as much as we need to recognize that, we can't say that that is the only reason why the Chinese Communist Party is a threat, through the Confucius Institutes. We need to recognize a few things, that it is an economic threat, it's a political threat because we see a lot of these corrupt politicians bowing down to the will of the Chinese Communist Party, right? And letting these Confucius Institutes fly, right? And some may say, well, 3 or 4 Confucius Institutes in that large country with a few universities, what's the big deal? Well, 3 or 4, right, can actually contain hundreds of students with the most influential politicians, right, getting their information, right, from there, and thereby affecting the entire policy of that country. So I would say I would even say one is one too many, right? So there's that. But and 3, what the United States has to do, right, is to, in my opinion, it needs to recognize with Latin America and to a point, we need to realign our trade relations with Latin America in general, and again, recognize that there's a lot of potential there that we can work together on. So, for example, I mean, I believe that if American companies work a lot more with Latin American companies, for example, that's one way. But the other thing is, people always scream that, well, they all want to come over here and just basically, take over. And to a point, I do see why people see that. But you have to remember, a lot of the Latin American, migrants that come over here, right? Many of them, they don't want to leave their country. They want to stay with their families, and if you ask them a question, would you rather be here or there with your families, they'll say, we'd rather be back home, right? So providing that alternative by investing more in Latin America, right, as Americans, right, and encouraging innovation in these different nations, I think that'll really help solve the problem. It will never solve the problem immediately, but it's a damn good start, might I say. And I think, to just wrap all that up, I feel like the thing that we must all remember is that Latin America will always be our neighbor, and you need to be good to your neighbors as much as they need to be good to you, right? And so, keeping that in mind, to a point, the United States made a commitment to at least keep the peace within the American continent, whether it's North America and South America. So, I feel like the United States probably needs to take that into consideration when it's thinking about bettering relations with South America, right? And utilize that approach to increase a lot of its allies within the region, because right now, if you look at the growth of the Belt and Road Initiative, we've done a pretty terrible job, keeping that peace.
Right, but this also comes in hand with the other side, which is the Latin American countries. Sure. So what should the government do with this Confucius Institute? Is it easy to to break the relationships with them?
No, it's not. And you will see a lot of these politicians being stuck, right? If you ask them, hey, you need to get rid of that. And a lot of them might even recognize the fact that it's bad, right? But they'll say, look, they've offered all of these benefits, right? And that's another thing that the Chinese Communist Party does. It throws in benefits, right? To a point where the people get enamored by it, right? And say, wow, this is great. And if their home government takes it away, right? That particular politician who made that happen is going to be pretty unpopular, right? And so that's another thing that they have to worry about. So I would say for the immediate term, right, is to get these, is for the United States to recognize some of these corrupt individuals, right, running these political systems in Latin America, and we should call them out, right? That's number one. Number two, encourage the opposition, right, to recognize that as well. Now, I'm not saying that we have to go in and just manage their political, atmosphere. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. What I'm saying is, encourage the people to help, to basically keep their government accountable. It has to happen on a grassroots level. Number two, we need to. One thing that I would personally recommend highly for private businesses is to go into Latin America, right? Compete with these Chinese companies, right? And give the alternative option to Latin Americans and say, look, we recognize the fact that we did things wrong in the past, right? Some good, some bad, but right now we're here to help you as good neighbors, and we need your help as well, right? To make this actual partnership work, right? Even I would say one of the things that would help is to point out the fact that as a nation, we made it extremely hard for Latin America to borrow money, right? IMF, for example, is a huge problem, right? And a couple of others. So, we really recognize the fact that we, to a degree, this globalist power has drove Latin America to see China as the alternative, which is in and of itself, a huge mistake in our part.
Right, and now it seems like it's not easy, given that there are a lot of countries that are turning into leftist governments. Exactly. So there's a challenge there. I do want to go back a little bit about the Confucius Institutes and the culture, because I think for young generations, the young people, they do see China as something very admirable. And actually, we've talked before, and you had a similar story. You definitely had this appreciation of Chinese culture, Chinese history, and I think from there, something, you might have read the wrong part of it. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to know a little bit more of your story. Can you tell us?
Yeah, so, I always call myself the success of the overall overseas Chinese propaganda. I've never been to China, right? I've never even been near to China to a point, right? But I can totally relate with the younger generation that are enamored with the works of the Chinese Communist Party. So to give you a brief story, right? I grew up in a generation where I saw the spectacular shows, put on by the CCP during the Beijing Olympics of 2008, right? The opening ceremony, it looked like everything was just in line. And for me, right, someone who was sort of confused with who I was or what I was even comfortable with or whatever, right? And other factors as well. I began to look at Marx, right? And what Marx eventually told me was, hey, maybe it's not you that's the problem. Maybe it's the entire system that's the problem that's causing, right, you to feel this way. And when I saw China, right, China was the one that embraced that particular ideology, but also at the same time had all the modern benefits that I was enjoying already, right? So I said to myself, wow, this is probably paradise on earth, right? And I remember in high school, one of my classmates actually reported on the Falun Gong, right? She wrote a paper. It was a world religion class, and she wrote a paper about the Falun Gong, right? She said that, I saw these people in the streets, and I asked them questions. It seems interesting, but they're going through X, Y, Z because of the Chinese government. I remember getting up during the Q&A time and just blasting her, right? Accusing her, telling her that what you're doing is basically taking down a government that's trying to make the lives of its people better, right? Now let's break that down a little bit, right? Trying to make the lives of the people better. What does that mean? It means that type of statement aligns with the old Soviet or even communist line of like, we need a revolution, endless amount of revolution in order to bring paradise on earth, right? So that was I would say pretty much deep within my heart, right? It was a huge part of me, right? So that's where my burst came from, right? And then in college, I attended this this academic session called the Veritas Forum, where a professor asked me a very, very simple question. He said, "How do you know what you know is true? How?" And I remember, even though it was a hypothetical question, right? I remember asking myself, how do I know what I know is true, right? So at that time, I was really passionate about China. I was planning to go study abroad in China. I was eventually going to advocate for China, here and there. But I decided, because during that time, I actually read a book regarding a Tiananmen Square survivor, and I actually invited him to come and to speak, because at that point, I said to myself, let me also educate myself to a point. But I was, it was a good session of information, but it was also when really when I visited Queen's Library, right, around Queen's Library area in Flushing, and met a Falun Gong practitioner that really helped me to turn to where I am today. And see, this practitioner was telling me about her sister, right, who was in prison. And mind you, it was like -20 degrees, right? And these small little ladies with these, I wouldn't even call thick jackets, but I think they were intentionally trying to show the word Falun Dafa is good, right? They were just out there handing out pamphlets. And I was thinking, what in the world is driving these people to come out here in this weather, right? But when I heard her story, it shocked me, and it helped, and something inside of me just told me to step back a little bit, right? And that's when I did a lot more research. NTD and Epoch Times helped me a lot in that regard. But even so that's my story. But going back to the situation in Latin America, for example, I see a lot of young people just being frustrated with society. There's lack of jobs, there's economic inequality, there's the people that you're supposed to trust, right? Corrupt officials, or even members of the church clergy, right, are all in it together to gain whatever they want for themselves, right? So for them, it's like, all they could fantasize is a world where they can be free of all of this, right? And China, to a point, comes up and says, hey, we're not really different from the cultural environment that you're in, right? And we have all this money and we have all these benefits. Come study here, but recognize the fact that we got it for you. Recognize the fact that we are the center of the world, right? And recognize the fact that the United States is the one that made all of this suffering happen in your life, right? And we see, and that's a huge ideological war that we have to fight. And again, but to me, that war could be won with a simple tactic. It's the enforcement of truth, right? I'm not talking about physically or militarily, but to really have this dialogue with people and to get them to understand that what they know may not necessarily be true, right? And create an environment where people can at least question what they know, right? And to come to accept the fact that not everything that a particular government offers to you is good, right? Maybe it's worth it to ask yourself, well, what's attached with this, right? And I think, fortunately so, a lot of people in Latin America, particularly in places like Colombia, Peru, and even in Brazil, are recognizing that. So I do see a hope there. Yeah.
SeHoon, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your personal story. Como siempre, los invitamos a dejar sus comentarios debajo del video y a compartir este episodio. Así la verdad puede llegar a más gente. También sigamos en contacto a través de Telegram de Opinión Pública y síganos en nuestras redes sociales por The Epoch Times en español. Gracias por acompañarnos en este episodio de Opinión Pública. Hasta la próxima.